I'm going to call back on stage Dr. Rajiv Modi, who will take us through the important innovation from Cadila Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Rajiv Modi, back again.
Thank you. I think earlier on I did mention about our wonderful things. Since I have been called back, there are lots of other things we're doing, and there are lots of failures. But we're so happy and proud that we have some successes, and we feel blessed that we have some successes. So Cadila is working on various forays, but today, and there have been many firsts in the world, and people around the world, not only people here today, but around the world are gaining to recognize. WHO, United Nations, and so on are getting to recognize that there is this company, there is India, and there is a company in India called Cadila Pharmaceuticals, which is doing what we're doing. But today I want to celebrate the one of them which is very dear to our hearts.
Very heartfelt good evening to all the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. To endorse the first innovative conclave, IAMICON'. It's a matter of great pride for me to invite the luminaries sitting here to start the innovative conclave, because with working with Cadila from last 31 years, it always gives me a pride and privilege that we work for the organization which provides the medicine which can be afforded by common person through your prescription. And today we all are endorsing about the personality, where we think about the personality at Cadila and many places our head bows down with lot of respect and tribute. I'm talking about our respected former chairman, Shri I.A. Modi. And when we think and when we memorize, our head goes up with lot of pride that yes, we represent the company which was first time which started in the Indian pharmaceutical industry, and we are a part of the company which provides all the innovative medicines which is going to take care for every nook and corner, not only in India, but across the globe. With this, it's a great pleasure of mine to invite the chairperson of this important conclave, Dr. Prem Pais. May I request Dr. Prem Pais to please come here on the dais. A small introduction. I think many of the Bangaloreans sitting here must be aware about Dr. Prem Pais. Dr. Prem Pais is the Dean and Professor of Medicine and Head of the Clinical Research and Training at St. John's Medical College, Bangalore. Dr. Prem Pais is the main coordinator in India for the TIPS, the Indian Polycap study. He has 74 peer review publications in international and national journals and 10 book chapters. So many more things are there for Dr. Prem Pais. It's a heartful welcome to Dr. Prem Pais here. May I also have a pleasure to invite another very important person to whom I know from last almost 17 years, because when I was based at Bangalore as a head of entire South, I used to meet all the personalities sitting here, and none other person, the moderator of this conclave, Dr. Nagaraj Desai. May I request Dr. Nagaraj Desai please come. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for hearing me. And now the show is on. The innovation conclave about the product is on, and now I request the chairperson, Dr. Pais, who was involved since the inception of this beautiful, imagined, magical product, Polycape. He is going to start this entire thing. May I request Dr. Prem Pais to take it over and start the proceedings through Dr. S.S. Ramesh. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rajput, and I have great pleasure to be here in front of this audience and with my friends Dr. Nagaraj Desai and Dr. Ramesh. It's also an honor for me to be at this meeting to remember Mr. Indravadan Modi, whom I had the pleasure of meeting when we started off this whole process of investigating and testing the Polycap. It is an innovation, and today's meeting is about the innovations that Mr. Indravadan Modi and Cadila have gone into. And there is no doubt that polycap, that seems such a simple thing, just putting 4 medicines in one capsule sounds very simple. But it's an innovation that no other company in the world has been able to do. Because putting a capsule like this together is more than just a cookery recipe of mixing the ingredients. One has to make sure of so many complexities like the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. Will it work as well as giving medication separately? Will people take the medicine? Will they comply with it better than they would if they were given separately? And of course, most of all, would it prevent the disease that you're trying to prevent? And unlike many other companies, and you know India is full of products of various combinations in one pill, Cadila decided to do this in a very scientific way. And TIPS 1 was a very unique study both for India and for the world, because it actually put to test whether this polycap could work as well as its individual products. And this is when the company had already done the PK and PD studies and showed that it was at least as good as competitive brands. We then, TIPS 2 showed that you can use it twice, a double dose, and it's still safe. And now I think Cadila, and for us as physicians and cardiologists, the fact that the drug is out in the market and is already at work saving many lives is something very unique. But for me, the greatest innovation will be now when we get the results of our TIPS 3 study. We know already that polycap can be used in secondary prevention in people who have already had problem. It's very effective in people who are at very high risk. But now we are actually putting it to test in a huge study, which is going to run for 5 to 6 years. We have patients coming from the Philippines, from India. We have recruited patients now from Canada. And we hope ultimately to have 5,000 to 7,000 patients. We have 1,000 already. And at the end of 7 years, we will be able to show, yes, people who are even at moderate risk, people whom we may otherwise not think of treating with more than one medicine, will or perhaps will not do better with a drug like polycap. So I think we are at the cusp of very exciting times and of a great innovation. And I would like at this stage to ask my colleagues, both Dr. Nagaraj Desai and Dr. Ramesh, what they think of this innovative product, and if they have used it, what their experience has been with it so far. Can I ask you first, Ramesh?
Sure. Should I finish the talk and then talk about the experience, or what is the schedule? Sure. Anyway, I'm supposed to speak on polycap and then we could discuss the various issues.
Really a pleasure to be associated this evening with this program. Yes, I also had met Mr. Indravadan Modi, and actually I was also part of the study. So this is a major innovation. All the cardiologists all over the world, especially in India, we are battling with the major problem of premature death and increased death rate due to coronary disease. And I would specifically thank Cadila and Dr. Salim Yusuf and Dr. Prem Paz for working together to come out with some solution in reducing the burden of cardiovascular disease, not only in India and all over the world. And they have made a major progress, and I'm happy to say that this drug, though we know individually each of these drugs have been effective both in primary and secondary prevention in reducing atherosclerotic disease, but a simple combination of these drugs now has shown that one pill a day, sometimes maybe 2 pills, can significantly reduce the cardiovascular disease burden and mortality associated with cardiovascular disease. I just briefly share the forward experience of this wonderful molecule. Actually, it was Archimedes that attributed this quote, "Give me a fulcrum and I shall move the world." And from what we have seen today in the various movies, Mr. Indravadan Modi took this very seriously and took forward this concept. And as I was just watching, I thought it rhymes well, Mr. Indravadan and innovation. And I think, and aptly, the IAMICON'. I mean, I think it applies to all of us. That I stands there, that each one of us should be part of this in trying to prevent a major killer. As I was talking some of the day, somehow all over the world, cancer or malignancy seems to dominate the thinking that it is the most malignant disease or the one that kills maximum people. Actually, you'll be surprised. The 6% of the mortality is actually due to malignancy, whereas more than 30% of the mortality in the worldwide is due to coronary disease or atherosclerotic disease. Actually, coronary disease kills more people than cancer. It is much more malignant. It affects most of the organs in the body. And I think we should pay more attention to atherosclerotic disease and try to prevent it. Now, an innovation, many of them attribute just for a research or a new molecule that is coming in or new development that happens, but not necessarily so. There are many other innovations. Sometimes an idea may be there, but just to translate it into actually reality is also an innovation. May not be a new discovery or a new molecule that is coming, but just to translate that thought into actually practice, that also is an innovation. We have gone through that. We redefine our treatment aspects. We redefine our diagnostic aspects. We constantly strive to improve the quality of life of a patient. All this involves innovation, not necessarily a new molecule that comes in. And ultimately, what we are looking at, something that saves millions of lives. This, I'm sure many of you have seen often. And definitely, if you have listened to a cardiologist talking about prevention, I'm sure this slide is often shown. Whereas you could see that today, non-communicable diseases form or contribute more than 50% of the morbidity and mortality all over the world, and of which, actually, of all the deaths that are reported worldwide, 30% of them are due to atherosclerotic heart disease, either heart disease or vascular disease, that means stroke and peripheral vascular disease. Of course, injuries and AIDS also, or HIV infection, also contribute. They attract worldwide attention, and especially HIV, probably because of the advanced course and the rapidity at which a patient progresses into a disability and death, attract more attention. But actually, atherosclerotic disease, being chronic in nature, takes more lives than any of these diseases combined, and this is the #1 killer today in the world. Now, into heart study again by Dr. Salim Yusuf crew clearly showed that, of course, Framingham heart study clearly showed that multiple risk factors do contribute to increased incidence of disease and mortality. But Interheart clearly studied various risk factors that we commonly see in the practice: smoking, diabetes, hypertension, the ratio of lipoprotein B versus A1, combination of these three factors, combination of multiple factors. What you see here is, as the combination increases, there is an exponential increase in the mortality. A combination of three risk factors, if the odds ratio of the first MI is about 16%, when all the 9 factors are combined, you see it almost 26-fold increase in the mortality. So, more the risk factors, more the problem of atherosclerotic disease. And when there are multiple risk factors, that, all the known risk factors that we have today, there is a very high mortality. Now, we have two major studies now where inter-heart study clearly showed that presence of multiple risk factor adds to the risk and increases the burden. And age is, of course, one of the non-modifiable risk factors also considered. Whereas a pure study showed another alarming trend and alarming problem that all of us as clinicians face, that there is a huge problem of non-compliance. As all of us face this problem, more the number of problem patient has, more the non-compliance. A patient has diabetes, patient has hypertension, patient has dyslipidemia. Now the number of medications he has to take significantly increases, and as more medications are given, the compliance comes down. It is a pure study clearly showed that majority of people who are on antiplatelet, beta blocker, ACE inhibitors, the compliance becomes lower and lower when you give them individual. Now, if you see here, when you see the combination of or various drugs, you see they did a study on both urban and the rural group, and a multination kind of a study, and they found out how many medications patients actually are taking, of which they found that in urban area where probably the recognition rate is high, the acceptance rate is high, definitely you found that the number of people taking more medication combination was higher compared to people in rural areas. That you could see here. And what you see here also is that taking all the medications, like the high income group was much higher compared to the low income group. Now the key to the solution of risk reduction also with individual intervention. If you see, it is well known that if the blood pressure, when you look at the risk reduction of coronary disease by effectively treating hypertension, is in the range of 20 to 25%. And of course, naturally, we know the risk reduction is much more for stroke compared to coronary disease with control of blood pressure. Whereas with dyslipidemia, it is about 20 to 25%, and for stroke, it is 35 to 40%. Platelet aggregability is 30 to 35% and 20 to 25%. What we are trying to say here is, just looking at one risk factor or one factor, the reduction in mortality is just only 1/3. There's still a large number of people, in spite of being treated, continue to have problems, morbidity and mortality. So just treating one individual risk factor is not enough to reduce the global burden of atherosclerotic disease. Now, what has been shown now is that just individual, for example, 10% reduction in blood pressure is almost same as 10% reduction total cholesterol. But when you combine the two, that you combine reduction in blood pressure as well as reduction in total cholesterol, you have a chance of reducing it by 45%. So, multiple risk factor intervention definitely contributes to a greater reduction in the morbidity and mortality associated with atherosclerosis. Now, this concept was, further taken up by Dr. Salim Yusuf, what showed with the polycap study that if you take one drug alone, the event rate, risk reduction is there, but the event rate reduction in 2 years is much less. But when you have a combined effect of all the drugs together, the risk reduction is highly significant, about 75% reduction in the risk. Now, a strategy to reduce cardiovascular death by more than 80% by Nicholas Ward, what he had shown that LDL cholesterol as identified risk factor, and you use statin to reduce it. A reduction of 1.8 millimoles of statin reduces the coronary event by 61% and the stroke rate by 17%. Similarly, blood pressure, it is, reduction of 11 millimeters of mercury, the coronary artery disease risk decreases by 46% versus stroke of 63%. But what is important here is a combined, suppose you look in totality of giving together a statin, the antihypertensive drugs, and a folic acid, and an aspirin. Sorry. Now all, you see the chance of reduction is about 88% for coronary event and 80% for stroke. This clearly shows that when you combine multiple molecules, your chances of reducing the burden of atherosclerotic disease is quite high. Now coming to compliance, that is a major issue that most of it what we have discussed is already known to you, that you treat hypertension, you treat dyslipidemia, you treat antiplatelet, reduce the platelet activity, you reduce the event. But the problem is when we start giving multiple drugs, because I'm sure all of us sometimes see when you start writing a prescription for a patient, suddenly you see your prescription pad full of maybe about 9 medicines, 10 medicines, 12 medicines, and obviously patient will find it baffling that he has to take so many medications, and many complain that the number of capsules or medicines he takes is much more than the food that he consumes, and the cost is almost 3 times, 4 times the cost of the food that he takes. That reduces the compliance rate, and once the compliance comes down, once he takes less medication, the risk factors are not really addressed, and he continues to have or exposed to the risk of coronary disease. This is what we see. If you take all the 3 medications, the chances of outcome is much higher compared to when they discontinue. This is the most important aspect in our practice, and that is what finally Cadila and Dr. Loomis and others have contributed, that if you can improve the compliance and address all these issues of managing hypertension, managing dyslipidemia, managing platelet activity, the chances of compliance improving, you can significantly reduce the disease burden. So we are looking at adherence as well as risk reduction here, and this is how the development milestone happened. In 2003 and 4, there was literature review, and the concept evolved that probably we combine the medication to reduce the burden. The protocol was drawn up in 2004. The 2006 to 8, the TIPS 1 clinical trial completed. Then they filed in 2009, and the TIPS 1 study result published in the Lancet in 2009, and that paved the concept and the use of combination of drugs in effectively reducing the cardiovascular burden. 2010, Polycap was launched in the Indian market. 2011, TIPS 2 clinical trial completed, and 2012, Wellcome Trust Award, TIPS 3 clinical trial commenced, which Dr. Prempa has alluded just now, and TIPS 3 trial recruits more than 1,000 patients in 2 countries. The Polycap, each hard gelatin capsule contains 3 antihypertensive drugs: hydrochlorothiazide, atenolol 50 mg, and ramipril 5 mg. 1 lipid lowering drug, that is simvastatin 20 mg, and 1 antiplatelet drug, that is acetylsalicylic acid aspirin 100 mg in intercoated form. Rightfully, there was more emphasis on hypertension because hypertension is the commonest illness that affects mankind. Actually, it is underestimated. The disease burden or the illness or the morbidity and mortality associated with hypertension is actually underestimated. Even today, in spite of JNC's 7 recommendation, in spite of European Society recommendation, many patients with hypertension continue to be untreated. We take a blood pressure of 140/90 very lightly. We feel that it is nothing significant, and we say that we will wait. And if you remember the studies, that 140/90 contributes to a major incidence of stroke and atherosclerotic disease, and hence in polycap there is a major contribution, or a major part of it is an antihypertensive drug. And being a chronic illness and most of them being asymptomatic, again hypertension, the non-compliance rate is also very high, and hence a combination will really help. So with polycap, what has been shown so far and what we feel will really help in the future is that not only is an excellent drug as a primary preventive drug, it also is an effective tool to manage secondary prevention, especially in patients who already have heart disease or stroke, peripheral arterial disease, and diabetes mellitus as a risk factor or already a manifest clinical event. Those without pre-existing disease, age is a major issue. 95% of deaths from ischemic heart disease and stroke occur in people more than 55-year-old, regardless of the risk factor. So, when we look at that, a large number of patients who fall into this category, who are more than 55-year-old, who already are either prone or have risk factors for coronary disease, atherosclerotic disease, or who are like, smokers, hypertensives, diabetics, patients with dyslipidemia, or who are already a manifest disease, like who already had an unstable angina or myocardial infarction or stroke, are all candidates to receive this drug. Now, when we combine, there is always a question whether they are as effective, the bioavailability of these drugs are as effective as given individually, and the studies have clearly shown that, as you can see here, their bioavailability is same whether given individually or in combination. Now, the control of blood pressure, we have found that equally good or actually more compared to one drug and 2 drug and 3 drug, a combination of drugs in a polycap is more effective, probably because of improved compliance. Similarly, the cholesterol reduction is almost the same. Of course, in the simvastatin alone, which has been shown to be adequate, of course, there will be a lot of debate this year with the recent publication of American College of Cardiology, guidelines, wherein, they are trying to talk that it is not the lipid level that is important, it is the dose of statin that is important, but that requires a lot of debate, and I'm sure in the next few months we will see multiple debates on that concept. But however, what we are trying to show here is given in a multi-drug combination, it is as effective as given alone. Similarly, the antiplatelet activity, there is no difference between aspirin given alone or given in the form of combined drug in polycap. Now, the Indian polycap study, what it clearly showed that the reduction in blood pressure and reduction in diastolic blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic, was same, whether with single dose and double dose. And double dose was safe in case the patient requires, instead of adding individual drugs, maybe you can double the dose of polycap, and that has been shown to be very effective in controlling the blood pressure. Similarly, the tolerability was also good, because there was a lot of concern whether, with 10 milligrams of ramipril, with 100 milligrams of atenolol and a higher dose, whether the tolerability will reduce. It has not been shown so, and it is quite tolerable. Now, the potential risk in both, if you combine the TIPS 1 and TIPS 2 study, final result is there was a 62% reduction in the coronary artery disease risk, 48% reduction in stroke with the low dose polycap. In TIPS 2 with full dose polycap, there was a 69% decrease in the incidence of coronary artery disease and 57% in stroke. There is a UMPIRE trial, a randomized open label blinded endpoint trial where they have recruited 1,000 patients from India and 1,004 patients from Europe, and what it showed is there was a threefold increase in compliance. Patient taking these medications, imagine instead of taking 5 drugs individually, you just take 1 pill. Obviously, we expect the compliance to improve. Now, many international publications have accepted this concept, and many of them have specifically mentioned polycap in their recommendation as a good drug to improve the cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. For example, European guidelines on cardiovascular disease in clinical prevention practice published in 2012 clearly wrote that reducing dosage demands in persons at high cardiovascular disease risk may result in the prescription of combined pharmacotherapy, the polypill. Recently, a randomized phase 2 trial in middle-aged individuals without cardiovascular disease demonstrated that polycap formulation could conveniently reduce multiple risk factors and thereby reduce the risk of atherosclerosis. Most of the major societies, whether European Society of Cardiology, American Heart Association, National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and American College of Cardiology, clearly have recommended that to improve the compliance as well as overall reduce the cardiovascular burden, I think the concept of polypill and polycap is here to stay. So ladies and gentlemen, to summarize, polycap is a unique example of an innovation which is affordable. Polycap has shown efficacy and safety in 2 large randomized patient trials, an effective strategy to prevent millions of deaths from cardiovascular disease. Clinical studies have shown polypill strategy could improve compliance in patients, and it is endorsed by most of the major organizations all over the world. Thank you.
And good friends of mine like Dr. Yavgal, Dr. Ramaswamy, and also many friends from my community of doctors. When we practice medicine, it looks like too simplistic approach is too difficult to accept by the physician. How can you prescribe just 1 drug and forget about it, saying that the compliance is good, compliance is comfortable, and studies have shown, hence, polypill concept is a good concept. In fact, that is one of the kind of resistance that one sees in the clinician's mind when we start prescribing medicines. For example, a pill which contains nearly 5 drugs, can it be comfortable to us? That is the kind of crux that we are kind of addressing. And that is possibly the reason why, the concept of giving multiple drugs in a single pill as an upfront therapy when we diagnose hypertension, unless there are issues like, demonstrated vascular disease, or the target blood pressures are so high that you require more than 1 drug that you want to start off with. So that could be some of the things that may be kind of bothering us as we are starting the prescription for, polypill, using 1 drug, 1 pill to control the risk factors or treat the patient to the targets. Now, as we learned from the presentations, as we learned from science of medical practices are a little different from the science as they have been published in the long time now. In fact, for example, if we know that the compliance is poor, still we kind of burden our patients with multiple pills, multiple kind of molecules. A typical patient of cardiovascular disease with our diabetes, ischemic heart disease, dyslipidemia, high blood pressure, so many varieties of risk factors being there, he will be definitely carrying a prescription of more than about 5 drugs at least. Hence, we have to look at the possibility of reducing the pill burden, no doubt about it. I'm very convinced that, if the person has a target which are higher, and there are multiple risk factors, even if the patient does not have any vascular disease documented, this is the way to go, that you give a single pill, and if the patient does not reach the target, you may consider giving 2 pills, as was demonstrated in TIPS 2 trial. Very important concept indeed. In my clinical practice, I would like to do that. Are there any caveats in such a statement? In fact, we clinicians have to consider the caveats in case there is something like published literature. Some time ago, we were considering diuretics as an important part of hypertensive therapy, antihypertensive therapy, and we learned from various trials that if you give diuretics in larger doses, we invite the problems of chronic large dose diuretic therapies. In fact, diuretics went out of vogue in our clinical armamentarium, though all hat was the one which showed the diuretics are good, and JNC stuck to diuretics as a first-line therapy. But we have seen in our practice, until we use diuretic as an add-on therapy for antihypertensive management, many a time the blood pressures remain at a higher levels. In other words, if a second drug is not a diuretic, or if at least third drug is not a diuretic, then if the blood pressure is not at a goal, it is not a good clinical practice. That has been taught to us in the recent times. Hence, we have started realizing the importance of combination therapies to manage our hypertension patients. In other words, if the targets are higher, if the targets are achievable by combination therapy, that is the way to go. And if the patient receives a combination therapy which are physiologically acceptable, then that is the way to go. In other words, if the patient is receiving a drug like hydrochlorothiazide and ramipril, then that is the way to go, and add on third drug, and then you see how the blood pressure gets controlled, and you can double the doses of these drugs and control the blood pressure in a much better manner. However, the molecule that has been chosen in this particular combination happens to be, I'm sure quite a few of us are itching to ask the question as to why atenolol and why a beta blocker when, for example, NICE guidelines removed beta blockers from the first-line therapy for using beta blockers as the first-line therapy for high blood pressure control. I'm sure my chairman colleague and my speaker faculty will have a couple of comments to make, and I'm sure quite a few, like Dr. Ramurthy and others, also would like to contribute to this discussion. And I'm sure when I pass on the mic to Dr. Prempayas, will have a point or two. Most importantly, it is the doctor's responsibility to make sure that the patient takes drugs. The compliance being as they are in our community too, and across the world, we have to reduce the pill burden, and this concept of polypill will come very handy to us to make sure that our patients are compliant to our therapies. Now, when drugs are being withdrawn due to side effects, and we have a patient on polypill, that could be a practical issue. And when you reinitiate therapy to control the vascular risk factors to the targets, then which one and how you would like to initiate therapies could also be an individual discretion that we should be thinking about. However, when we use multiple drugs in a single pill, physician may find or may feel that there is a loss of freedom to kind of select a molecule when he is prescribing therapy. That could be again discussed during discussion time. However, Dr. Ramesh brought up about the guidelines which have been published by American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association in the recent times, which has come into under severe criticism in the recent times, especially for calculating the risk that is attributed to the vascular factors. We can also discuss that as we go along. With those remarks, the molecules which are present in this polypill are good ones. They have been documented, and the targets could be easily achieved as have been seen in the randomized trials. This is the way to go when you're treating a complex patient of vascular disorder with multiple risk factors which require to be brought under control. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Desai. I think audience have been very patient, and perhaps it's the time to give them a chance to give any comments, questions, anything that they would like to raise from the floor. I hope there's a mic available for anyone from the floor. Dr. Bingi, would you like to comment on any experience that you have or any?
I think the polycap is really a nice concept in that we have been knowing that it has been already done in studies and particularly secondary prevention, but we have to take it with a pinch of salt whether it can be used as a primary prevention. That is where we have to really look into that. But there is a small suggestion was done that if you take an age factor above the age of 55 as a very important risk factor, one can start off as a primary therapy. That is what it means. But the point is sometimes we feel a little embarrassing to pose this sort of a phenomenon. Now, if you look at the ingredients are mostly they're starting with the first generation molecules. Now, as we moved up, there are people who have been using, if you take up the practice pattern itself, atorvastatin is being more frequently used than a simvastatin. Are we lagging behind by holding on to the polycap is the point. Probably they may have to take a cue in making the ingredients and coming out with other sort of a capsule in tune with the times. Thank you.
That this polycap now is the first of a concept, and if it is proved, if it works well, if it sells well, it doesn't mean that you can't have one more. And what I understand is that there's some work going on. For example, already in TIPS 3, there is the polycap without aspirin, so that in case you have patients who, it's not yet licensed, but the trial is being done with a version of polycap without aspirin. So you have a choice of using prevention without aspirin, because as we know in primary prevention, the role of aspirin is not clear. In fact, TIPS 3 is testing that. The second, I also understand that some preliminary work has started in using atorvastatin instead of simvastatin, because in South Africa, where there's a lot of HIV, simvastatin interacts with some anti-HIV drugs, whereas atorvastatin, that interaction is much less. So that's it. So the thing is that I'm sure if this catches on, there will be other versions, like amlodipine could be used instead of beta blocker, especially in primary prevention. You wanted to say something?
One more, as Dr. Nagaraj has told, this doctors can lose their independence in giving the prescription because it is a polypill. There are some disadvantages. Persons are sensitive to some particular medicines, like aspirin, he is sensitive. So how it is to be replaced in place of aspirin? And other question is, as the people are becoming more allergic to different type of medicines, so polypill, how will give the answer? And suppose the patient is having a high BP like 170 by 100, they are giving atenolol 100 mg. when the BP comes to normal, how can adjust the dosage of the medicine when it is in a polypill?
Let me answer your third question, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues. We have done that study of TIPS 2, particularly for that reason. So TIPS 1 used a single dose, that is 50 mg of atenolol, 12.5 hydrochlorothiazide, 5 mg of ramipril. And in TIPS 2, it was the double dose. And what TIPS 2 showed, that blood pressure comes down, it doesn't come down dramatically. That is the reason we actually use multiple drugs. If you use one drug, the effect of a particular dose, if you double the dose, the effect does not double. It begins to flatten off. And therefore, there is no fear that if you use a double dose and the blood pressure has come down to what you think now is an acceptable, it's not going to continue to fall. So you have to hold that particular dose. And TIPS 2 also showed that the side effects of a double dose was really very little different. The only difference between a double dose and a single dose was due to aspirin. There was more gastritis because you used 200 milligrams of aspirin instead of 100 milligrams. You would like to?
Yeah, I think, to answer what Dr. Nagaraj Desai posed, Dr. Bingi, and what has been shown is, especially and I have raised this issue with Cadila many times, and of course we have searched for the answer. Why atenolol, with all the controversy that was raised with the meta-analysis? But actually that meta-analysis itself is flawed. There are many issues raised about that meta-analysis, basically based on 3 trials when they compared Alhat and Ascot and Ascot BPL trial and the live study. That is how combined, and then they said they found the trial, the group which received atenolol had a little higher mortality compared to other group. But if you really analyze the data, it is not really due to atenolol. This is an issue many have discussed. It is the other group which received AC inhibitors and ARB. We know now for a fact that AC inhibitors and ARB have much more protective in terms of renal protection, in terms of atherosclerotic protection. They have much more protective action compared to any other drug. So in that arm where they used, it is not just amlodipine, or it is the ARB and the AC inhibitor that were used in the other arm, which produced more protection, which was not seen with those group which received atenolol. But it was reported that the group which had atenolol had a higher mortality. It is the way you put it. Rather than trying to say that ARBs and AC inhibitors produced more protection, it was shown that atenolol had a higher mortality. And actually, if you really see most of the studies, it is all class effect. Whether it's the beta blocker, whether it's the AC inhibitor, or whether it is the ARB, or it is a statin. If you see the drug, fine, every few years somebody comes with some new molecule. But if you really see, for example, if you talked about simvastatin, if you compare the studies, simvastatin was the atorvastatin was the rosuvastatin, really, except for the bias of the reporting. In terms of mortality reduction, in terms of reduction in events, there is no really difference. The FOREST study significantly reduced the cardiovascular morbidity and mortality with simvastatin, and the same thing is seen with atorvastatin, and same thing is seen with rosuvastatin. As cardiologists, as doctors, we always would like to be first. A new molecule comes, somebody comes and says, fine, it has some advantages, fine, we give. Fine, atorvastatin and rosuvastatin supposed to have a little more beneficial effect whenever the triglycerides are rise compared to simvastatin. But FOREST study clearly showed that even triglycerides was reduced with simvastatin. So, I really feel some of this are hype. All of them have class effect. It has been repeatedly shown in various trials that one drug is not much different from another drug in the same class. So I feel the combination part has come out all right. And both these studies, TIPS 1 and TIPS 2, clearly showed that this combination is tolerable. There are very little increase in the side effect. At TIPS 1, if you really see, all the drugs were given individually, in combination, and together. You know, there was a 9 component to this study. Each drug was given individually for a group and then combined in the form of 2 drugs together, 3 drugs together, and then all the drugs together. And there was no increase in the side effects. Compliance was far better. And in TIPS 2, when we doubled the dose, still it was more tolerable. Now, when you look at all these things, I mean, I think this concept, of course, this concept, I would not say, it is totally new. I mean, we have used combination of beta blockers when diuretics. We have used it in antibiotics. We actually, American College of Cardiology has said, because hypertension and dyslipidemia is commonly associated, FDA has already approved a combination of amlodipine and atorvastatin in US, where, in US market is where they are very stringent about combining the drugs. Whereas in India, we have been doing this and we haven't really found any significant side effect or problem. But even in US now, this concept is coming up that to improve the compliance, you can combine the drugs. And when combining the drugs, as long as it does not reduce the bioavailability of the drug, it does not increase the side effect of the drug, and it is better tolerated and compliance increases, I think it is beneficial. I think that is a message that we are trying to repeatedly give from this study. Of course, there are always individual patients wherein you may not be able to manage with just one pill. You may still have to give additional drugs. But when you see overall, instead of 10 drugs, you are now then giving 2 drugs or 3 drugs, whereby the this we have always done. There are combination of atenolol, nifedipine, atenolol and amlodipine, atenolol now with clinidipine. But in an individual patient, we do add, sometimes we give a combination, and then we again give individual drugs, increase the dose. That, of course, you have to tailor it to an individual patient. But what we are talking about, looking at the global burden of the disease and the large number of patients affected, if one single drug is acceptable, can improve the compliance and reduce the burden, I think then it is effective as a primary prevention, even as a secondary prevention. I'm sure all of us have wished many times, especially when you write a prescription. I mean, I have many times wondered, a patient has hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia, and some other coronary disease. By the time, actually the doctor himself gets tired by the time he starts writing prescription. Yes, there was a period, an early period, more medicine a doctor wrote, patient liked it. Probably the doctor was considered to be good when more medicines are written. Today, I don't think that scene is there because of the cost considerations, because of the convenience. Many patients complain when you write multiple drugs that is it necessary to take so many drugs? Because when you write individually the drugs, the cost significantly increases. Actually, I was surprised when I talked about, for example, if you write clopidogrel and aspirin separately, clopidogrel is more expensive compared to when you combine clopidogrel and aspirin. Probably, it has something to do with the government policy, but whatever it is, all of us, ultimately in practice, we would like to reduce the cost of treatment, improve the compliance, and thereby, reduce the disease burden. And I think Polycap has fitted somewhere in that scheme of things. And if we can improve the quality of life to the patient, if we can contribute to improving the compliance and reducing the disease, I think we have achieved something in this.
Thanks, Ramesh. Any other questions or comments? If not, I think we've had a good evening, and 2 things. We have recognized Mr. Indravan Modi and the company. We recognize the innovations, and today we spent some time talking of one of the main innovations, the Polycap, and its place in the practice of medicine. And let me end by saying we should look beyond not just individual doctors like you and I are, but when we look at systems and states and countries, can a drug like Polycap be used across populations rather than think only of a doctor and a patient? Because ultimately for a disease like cardiovascular disease, when we're talking of millions and millions of patients, we have to think of new strategies if we really want to bring down this mortality. And I think Polycap or things like Polycap are going to play a major role in that strategy. Thank you.